The history of humanity is marked by empires that fall and kings that perish, but there exists a unique demise that did not mark an end, but an axis upon which would turn the destiny of the world. It did not occur in the center of Roma, but in a dusty and rebellious province. There a man was not executed simply by the laws of men, but by a convergence of divine and political forces. The crucifixion of Jesus de Nazareth is not only a theological event, it is the historical moment where absolute suffering met with an eternal purpose. To understand the magnitude of this sacrifice, we must go back before the nails, toward the silence that preceded the storm that would change eternity forever. The scenario of the cosmic and political tension. To comprehend the death of Jesus, it is insufficient to look only at the cross. First, we must dissect the world that built that cross. The execution on Golgotha was not a spontaneous accident, nor an isolated judicial error, but the inevitable result, almost mathematical, of a clash of tectonic forces that had been brewing for centuries in the basin of the Mediterranean. Judea, in the 3rd decade of the 1st century, was not the bucolic land of peaceful shepherds and clear skies that Renaissance art has tried to sell us. It was a geopolitical pressure cooker, an open and suppurating wound on the eastern flank of the Roman Empire, a volatile region where radical monotheistic faith clashed frontally with the brutal and polytheistic pragmatism of the imperial machinery. Since the legions of Pompeo Magno profaned the most holy place in the year 63 BC, entering on horseback where only the high priest could step once a year, a dense shadow had extended over the promised land. The relationship between Roma and Jerusalem was not of ruler and ruled, but of jailer and prisoner. The Jews did not see the Romans merely as foreign administrators or tax collectors, but as a living theological abomination, the kittim of the dark prophecies. And the Romans, in their turn, looked at the Jews with a mix of fascination and repulsion. For the Roman mind, obsessed with order, engineering, and visible gods, the Jews were an obstinate people, almost atheist in their rejection of idols, obsessed with an invisible God whom they could not conquer, bribe, nor comprehend. The famous Pax Romana was not a peace of harmony, but a peace of submission imposed by the edge of the Gladius Hispana and the constant threat of the crucifixion, a method of execution that the Romans did not invent, but that they perfected with industrial efficiency not to take life, but to torture, humiliate, and exhibit the power of the state over human flesh. In the vortex of this political storm was found the figure of the prefect, Poncio Pilato. Popular culture and religious creeds often portray him as a weak bureaucrat, washing his hands, a confused philosopher dragged by the tide. However, the historical records of Flavio Josefo and Filon de Alejandría paint us a very different picture, much darker, realistic, and terrifying. Pilato was not a soft man. He was a veteran military man, a hardened Roman equestrian, cynical and prone to calculated cruelty. His mandate in Judea was stained by incidents of administrative brutality. We know that he introduced standards with the image of the emperor in Jerusalem under the cover of night, provoking almost a massive insurrection where thousands of Jews offered their necks to the swords of his soldiers before tolerating idolatry. We know that he used the sacred money of the Corban to build an aqueduct, and when the people protested, he sent soldiers disguised as civilians with clubs under their tunics to grind the crowd to a pulp with blows. Pilato governed with fear, but not fear of his subjects, but of the wrath of Roma. His political patron in Roma, the powerful Sejano, was losing influence or had already fallen, and the Emperor Tiberio, secluded on the island of Capri, governed with a growing syphilitic paranoia. Any report of disturbances in the provinces, any failure in collection, could mean the end of the political career of a prefect, the exile to Gaul. Pilato walked on the edge of a political razor every day, and Jesus de Nazareth would become the stone that threatened to make him stumble. On the other hand, in the opposite corner of the ring was the Sanhedrin, led by José Caifás. The high priest was not a mystic with his head in the clouds. He was a Sadducee aristocrat, a cold-blooded, pragmatic politician who had to negotiate the physical survival of his nation in the face of the Roman giant. Caifás understood the cold mathematics of power better than anyone. His famous phrase, "It is convenient for us that one man die for the people, and not that the whole nation perish," is not a religious prophecy on his lips, but a utilitarian calculation. The Temple of Jerusalem, which Caiaphas administered, was not just a church. It was the central bank of Judea, the Supreme Court, the heart of the national identity, and the last bastion of Jewish autonomy. It generated millions in current currency through the trade of sacrificial animals and the exchange of currencies. Jesus of Nazareth, with his triumphal entry into Jerusalem and the violent cleansing of the merchants from the temple, overturning tables and stopping the financial flow with a whip of cords, was not only preaching theology, he was attacking the economic waterline and the political authority of the priestly elite. For the guardians of order, his elimination was not a crime of passion, but a strict necessity of state to avoid a Roman intervention that would destroy the temple. The Last Supper, the rite of radical transition. The narrative accelerates vertiginously on the eve of the Passover, the 14th of Nisan. Jerusalem was crowded to the point of logistical collapse. The population of the city, normally of some 50,000 inhabitants, tripled or quadrupled with pilgrims arrived from all corners of the Mediterranean, from Cyrene to Roma, from Babylonia to Egypto, to celebrate the liberation from slavery. The air of the city was dense, charged with the smell of wood smoke, spices, human sweat, and, above all, the metallic smell of the blood of thousands of lambs that had been slaughtered in the temple that same afternoon in a sacrificial assembly line. But in an upper room of the upper quarter, far from the tumult and the chants of the streets, a ceremony much more intimate, tense, and somber was being carried out that would redefine the very concept of sacrifice for the human species. The Synoptic Gospels describe the Last Supper not as a simple sentimental farewell, but as a foundational act, a liturgical earthquake. When Jesus took the unleavened bread and the cup of wine, his words must have sounded like a silent and disconcerting thunder in the minds of his disciples, rough men, fishermen, and ex-collectors who still expected, deep down, an earthly kingdom where they would expel the Romans by sword thrusts. "This is my body. This is my blood of the new covenant." One must understand the weight of this. For 1,500 years, the blood of animals had been the only means of atonement, a constant and visual reminder of the insurmountable distance between the absolute holiness of God and the moral imperfection of man. Millions of liters of animal blood had run down the altars. But Jesus, in that moment, was declaring that the system of shadows, the old religious apparatus, was reaching its operational end. He himself would be the Lamb. He was, with full awareness and will, signing his own sentence and transforming it into an eternal covenant. He was not being dragged to the end. He was orchestrating it as a liturgy. Juan, the beloved disciple, in his account, adds a dimension of radical humility that contrasts violently with human ambition, the washing of the feet. In an Oriental society where hierarchy was everything, where the dust and dung of the roads covered the dignity of travelers, the master took off his cloak, girded himself with a towel, and assumed the form of a non-Jewish slave. The sound of the water falling into the basin must have been deafening in the uncomfortable silence of the room, but the beauty of the moment was stained by a tangible darkness present in the room. A shadow with a name, Judas Iscariote. The figure of Judas has fascinated and horrified psychology and theology for 2 millennia. What leads a man to sell his mentor, his friend, his God? Was it simple greed? Was it the political disillusionment of a zealot upon seeing that Jesus did not initiate the holy war against Roma? The most tragic theory suggests that Judas was trying to force the hand of Jesus, putting him in an impossible situation to oblige him to manifest his divine power and destroy the enemies. Whatever the motive, the price is insulting: 30 pieces of silver. In the ancient law of Exodus, that was the price of compensation stipulated for a slave accidentally killed by an ox. The message of the high priests in setting that price was clear and devastating. For them, the Messiah of Israel was not worth more than a disposable slave, an administrative accident. When Judas left the room after receiving the morsel, the Gospel of Juan adds a chilling detail, purely cinematographic in its brevity, and it was night. It did not refer only to the absence of photons from the sun, it was the night of the human soul. The light of the world was about to be extinguished by the betrayal of one of his own. Jesus, knowing with supernatural precision that the traitor had set in motion the irreversible gears of his arrest, did not flee. He sang a hymn and walked voluntarily toward the exterior darkness. Gethsemane, the physiological battle and the absolute terror. If the Last Supper was the theological and mental preparation, the Garden of Gethsemane was the physical, emotional, and biological collapse. Situated at the foot of the Mount of Olives, crossing the Kidron Brook, this garden of oil presses became the stage of an agony that modern medical science has analyzed with clinical astonishment. Here, the human nature of Jesus manifests itself with a crudeness that defies any romantic or pictorial idealization. The texts describe that his anguish was such that his sweat was like great drops of blood that fell to the earth. For centuries during the Enlightenment and the rise of rationalism, critics dismissed this as a pious legend or a literary hyperbole. However, contemporary forensic medicine and dermatology recognize this phenomenon as hematidrosis or hemohydrosis. This is an extremely rare clinical condition, documented in medical history only under unbearable levels of physical or psychological stress. What happens physiologically? Severe anxiety causes the brain to activate the sympathetic nervous system to the maximum, flooding the body with chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol in massive and toxic quantities. This causes an extreme vasoconstriction followed by a rapid vasodilation that ruptures the fine capillaries that feed the sweat glands. The blood filters out, mixes with the sweat and erupts through the pores of the skin. This reveals to us a devastating truth about the state of Jesus at that moment. He was not walking toward his execution with the stoic indifference of a Greek philosopher like Socrates, nor with the disconnected trance of a religious fanatic. He was terrified. His body, his mammalian biology, reacted to the imminent horror with a cellular rejection. The skin, now sensitive and extremely fragile due to this condition, would be left much more susceptible, almost raw, to the pain of the blows that would come later. In the solitude of those ancient olive trees, whose twisted roots seemed to imitate his internal pain, Jesus faced the final temptation, stronger than that of the desert, the temptation of flight. He could have escaped to the desert of Judea in a matter of minutes. He knew the terrain. It was night. He could have disappeared. His prayer, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me," is perhaps the most honest declaration in human history. The cup, in the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament, was not a literal drink. It symbolized the accumulated divine wrath against evil. Jesus not only feared the physical torture of the Romans, the metal and the bone, he feared the spiritual rupture, the absolute isolation of carrying the toxic darkness of the world, a separation from his Father that he had never experienced. But the cosmic victory was not won when he resurrected, not even on the cross, but there, on the damp earth, when he whispered between gasps, "But not my will be done, but yours." It was the supreme triumph of conscious will over the instinct of biological preservation. The arrest, the betrayal and the violence. The tense and supernatural calm of the garden was violently broken. The silence was torn by the noise of boots, the clash of metals and the orange and crackling glow of the torches that snaked up from the valley. Not just a few bailiffs came. The texts and the historical context suggest a considerable force, a cohort along with the guard of the temple, all armed with swords and clubs, guided by Judas. The disproportion was absurd, an army to arrest an unarmed carpenter. The visual contrast must have been shocking, the serenity of the sacred garden violated by the brute force of the state and institutionalized religion. The betrayal was consummated with an act of perverted intimacy that chills the blood. In the culture of the Middle East, the kiss is not trivial. It is a sacred greeting of respect, of equality and brotherhood between rabbis and disciples. Judas took this supreme symbol of love and trust and turned it into a weapon, a tactical signaling tool to identify his prey in the darkness of the olive trees. "Hail, Master," he said, and kissed him effusively. The response of Jesus, "With a kiss you deliver the Son of Man," was not a cry of anger, but a question laden with a deep, unfathomable sadness that cut more than any steel sword. Chaos erupted briefly. Pedro, impulsive, loyal but desperate, unsheathed a short sword and launched a clumsy but lethal blow, cutting off the ear of Malcho, the personal servant of the high priest. Blood splattered. This moment is crucial to understand the nature of Jesus. In the midst of mortal danger, with adrenaline shot, the threat system activated and death breathing down his neck, Jesus stopped the escalation of violence. "Return your sword to its place, for all who take the sword, by the sword will perish." And, in a final act of mercy before his hands were tied with rough ropes, he touched the wound of his enemy and healed him. Even on the edge of the abyss, he refused to become the warrior and violent Messiah that his friends expected. But the compassion was not reciprocal. The disciples, those who hours before had sworn loyalty until the end and drunk from his cup, were devoured by instinctive panic. Fear is contagious. They fled among the shadows of the olive trees, losing themselves in the night, leaving their master absolutely alone. Jesus was tied like a dangerous animal, beaten and dragged back to the city, not as a respected rabbi, but as a criminal of the worst kind. The descent from the Mount of Olives toward the Kidron Valley and the steep climb toward Jerusalem marked the beginning of his physical Via Dolorosa, long before carrying the cross. The trial before the Sanhedrin, the nocturnal illegality. What happened next in the dead hours of the early morning was a mockery of Jewish justice, a legal farce designed with a single purpose: rapid elimination before the people awoke. Jesus was taken first before Annas, the former high priest and true godfather of power in Jerusalem. Annas was an astute patriarch, immensely rich, who controlled the strings of the temple and the trade of sacrifices. It was a preliminary interrogation, illegal and coercive, intended to find cracks in his defense before the formal trial. Subsequently, he was transferred across the cold stone courtyards to the house of Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin, the council of 71 elders, had gathered in urgency, something unheard of. According to rabbinic law and the tradition of the Mishnah, a capital trial had strict rules designed to protect the accused. It could not be held at night. It could not be held during a festival. The sentence could not be dictated on the same day as the trial, and the accused could not be condemned solely by his own confession. That night, driven by fear and hatred, the judges of Israel broke each and every one of their own sacred rules. The trial was a chaos of purchased false testimonies that contradicted each other. This one said he would destroy the temple. They babbled. Frustration grew among the leaders. Jesus, bruised and bound, remained in a disconcerting, almost regal silence. He did not defend himself. He did not argue legalisms. He did not plead for mercy. His silence was a polished mirror where the moral corruption of his judges was reflected. Finally, Caiaphas, exasperated and needing a clear confession to justify the condemnation before the people and before himself, stood up and threw the definitive question, conjuring him by the living God: "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" The response of Jesus sealed his fate and split religious history in two. "I am," he responded, using the ego eimi, an allusion to the divine name revealed to Moises, and added the prophecy of Daniel: "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power of God, and coming on the clouds of heaven." It was a declaration of divinity unequivocal, direct and absolute. Caiaphas tore his garments, a mandatory theatrical gesture of horror at the blasphemy, but also a hidden sign of internal political triumph. He had him now. "He has blasphemed. What more need have we of witnesses?" The tribunal condemned him unanimously, but there was an insurmountable technical obstacle. Under Roman occupation, the Sanhedrin had lost the ius gladii, the right to execute the capital penalty. They could excommunicate, whip, but they could not apply the death penalty legally. To see Jesus buried, they would have to convince Roma that this rural preacher was not just a Jewish heretic, but a political threat to the Caesar. The night ended with the first cycle of unbridled physical abuses. The guards of the temple, seeing Jesus condemned and unprotected, no longer saw him as a man. They gave free rein to their accumulated sadism. They spat in his face, covering him with filth. They blindfolded him and began a cruel game of the little blind hen, hitting him with their fists and mocking his prophecy. "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that struck you?" The dignity of the man was systematically dismantled. The face that, according to the Christian faith, had contemplated eternal glory before the foundation of the world, was now swollen, bruised, and covered in spittle and blood. The sun was beginning to rise over the hills of Jerusalem, bathing the temple in golden light. Good Friday had arrived. The religious machinery had done its dirty part. Now Jesus had to be handed over to the bureaucratic monster of Roma. While the city awoke to celebrate the freedom of the Passover and sacrifice its lambs, the only truly free man was in chains, waiting to be taken before Pilato to face the final judgment of the world. The Praetorium, the clash of two worlds. When the sun rose over Jerusalem that Friday, it did not illuminate any ordinary day, but the stage of the most complex and stratified injustice in legal history. We often think of justice as a blind and equitable ideal, represented by a scale, but in the ancient world, the law was simply a tool of power, an extension of the will of the strongest. What was about to happen in the governor's palace was not a fair trial. It was a high-level political transaction. The innocence of a man became the currency of exchange to buy the stability of a province. Jesus of Nazareth had survived the betrayal of his intimate friend and the visceral hatred of his religion, but now he had to face something much colder, impersonal and lethal, the efficient bureaucracy of the Roman Empire. Here, on the stone pavement of the Praetorium, Hebrew theology would clash violently against Latin pragmatism. It was early, probably around 6 in the morning, when the procession of the Sanhedrin, dragging a battered Jesus, arrived at the gates of the Fortress Antonia, the official residence of Poncio Pilato when he was in Jerusalem. Here the first absurd cultural conflict occurs. The Jewish leaders, the same ones who were bringing a man to be executed, refused to enter the pagan precinct. According to the Gospel of Juan, entering the house of a Gentile would leave them ritually impure to eat the Passover dinner that night. The irony is devastating and almost comical. They were willing to commit a judicial crime through false testimony, but not to step on foreign soil for fear of ritually staining themselves. They prioritized ceremonial purity over moral purity. Pilato, the representative of the most powerful man on earth, the Caesar Tiberio, was forced to come out to the courtyard to attend to them. This detail is not minor. It establishes the tone of irritation of the entire interaction. Pilato hated Jerusalem, he hated its superstitions, and he hated being woken up to resolve religious disputes. When he asked with disdain, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" he expected a concrete Roman legal charge: homicide, robbery, tax evasion. The Sanhedrin knew perfectly well that the accusation of blasphemy meant nothing to a polytheistic Roman who worshipped a pantheon of gods and a deified emperor. If they told Pilato that Jesus believed himself to be God, Pilato would have laughed or would have kicked them out. That is why, with a diabolical cunning, they changed the narrative. The religious accusation metamorphosed into a lethal political accusation designed specifically to activate the Roman national security alarms. "We have found this man perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." The word king was the nuclear trigger. In the Roman lexicon, rex was a dangerous word, loaded with a history of civil wars. Only the Caesar was the absolute sovereign, the dominus. Any other claim of royalty without the express permission of the Senate was, by strict definition, crimen lese majestatis, high treason punished with the capital penalty. Pilato, who until that moment looked with disdain at the matter as a fight of rabbis, now had to act. The imperial machinery had been activated. He could not ignore a potential rival of the Caesar without putting his own head at stake. The interrogation: philosophy versus the sword. Pilato had Jesus enter the Praetorium, far from the shouting crowd, into the cool and shaded intimacy of the audience hall. Here occurs one of the most fascinating and strange dialogues in universal history. A Roman governor, wrapped in the purple of his office, surrounded by military insignia, with the power of life and death in a snap of his fingers, in front of a Galilean carpenter, beaten, dirty, with a swollen face and tied hands. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilato. His tone probably oscillated between incredulity and curiosity. He was not looking for theology, he was looking for insurrection. He was looking for armies, weapon caches, conspiracy maps, rebel funds. He looked at Jesus and did not see a warrior, he saw a wreck. The response of Jesus disarmed the binary political logic of Pilato. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I would not be delivered. But my kingdom is not from here." For the first time in his career, Pilato found himself before something he could not classify in his mental files. He was accustomed to dealing with violent rebels, religious fanatics, sicarii and thieves. He understood greed, ambition, violence. But this man did not want the throne of Judea. He did not want to expel the legions. He spoke of a kingdom of truth. Pilato, a man educated in Roman philosophical skepticism, responded with the famous phrase that has resonated through the centuries as the hymn of moral relativism: "What is the truth?" For a pragmatic Roman politician, truth was not an abstract concept. Truth was what the strongest dictated, what served the empire, what was convenient. Finding no military threat, seeing that this man was a harmless philosopher and not a warlord, Pilato reached his first firm legal conclusion and announced it to the crowd: I find no crime in him. The interlude of Herodes, the silence of God. Searching desperately for a diplomatic way out to not condemn an innocent man, nor enrage the Sanhedrin, Pilato discovered a geographical technicality. Jesus was Galilean. That automatically put him under the jurisdiction of Herodes Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, who was conveniently in Jerusalem for the festival. Pilato sent Jesus to Herodes, passing the political responsibility to another. Herodes Antipas was a character radically different from Pilato. Frivolous, superstitious, hedonistic and morally corrupt. He was the man who had beheaded Juan el Bautista, the cousin of Jesus, in the middle of a drunken party for the whim of a dancer. Upon seeing Jesus, he was glad, but not out of piety or spiritual interest, but out of morbid curiosity. He had heard about the miracles. He hoped to see a magic trick, a live miracle for his personal entertainment, like one who watches an illusionist at court. Herodes bombarded Jesus with questions. The priests and scribes who had followed the procession accused him, shouting with vehemence. But Jesus did something extraordinary, something that requires a titanic inner strength. He said absolutely nothing, not a single word. Before Pilato he had spoken because Pilato, although cynical, sought to understand the facts. Before Herodes, who only sought spectacle and mockery, Jesus kept an absolute and thunderous silence. That silence was a divine judgment against the puppet king. It was a total contempt for his moral authority. Herodes, humiliated by the lack of response and feeling ignored by this ragged prisoner, despised Jesus. Together with his soldiers they dressed him in a splendid robe, mocking his supposed royalty, and returned him to Pilato. The situation was again in Roman hands. Barabbas, the plebiscite of evil. Pilato, frustrated by the return of the prisoner, attempted one last masterful political maneuver, appealing directly to the people to bypass the priests. He used the custom of the Paschal amnesty, where the governor released a prisoner of popular choice. He offered the people a binary, dramatic and clear choice: Jesus of Nazareth, the healing master, or Jesus Barabbas. The figure of Barabbas is crucial and often misunderstood. The Gospels describe him as a bandit, but this term was the one the Romans used for guerrilla revolutionaries and terrorists. Barabbas was not a simple pickpocket. He was a famous insurgent, a leader of the resistance who had committed homicide during a recent revolt in the city. In an ironic sense, Barabbas was exactly the Messiah the people wanted, a violent fighter who eliminated Romans. Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah they needed, but did not want, a spiritual savior who spoke of loving enemies. The crowd, skillfully manipulated by the high priests who moved among the people whispering slogans, shouted their verdict. It was the first democratic election recorded in the history of Christianity, and humanity chose the murderer. "Release to us Barabbas." Pilato, cornered and visibly disturbed, asked, "What then shall I do with Jesus, called the Christ?" The response was a unison, primitive and terrifying roar that still resonates in the Western conscience: "Crucify him." Pilato, wanting to placate the bloodthirsty mob without necessarily ending the life of Jesus, or perhaps naively hoping that a lesser but brutal punishment would be enough to satisfy them, ordered the flagellation. "I will punish him then and release him." Here the story ceases to be a legal drama and enters its darkest, bloodiest and physiologically horrendous chapter. The flagellation, anatomy of a torment. It is imperative to stop here and dissect the horror. We often read in ancient texts the phrase, "and having scourged him," and quickly turn the page. But to understand the price of the sacrifice, we must understand the biology of the flagrum. The Roman flagellation was not a simple corrective corporal punishment. It was a form of halfway death, a procedure calculated to leave the victim on the verge of systemic collapse without finishing him. Yet, unlike Jewish law, which limited the lashes to 40-1 out of mercy, Roman law had no limit. The executioners, called lictors, stopped only when the centurion in charge saw that the prisoner was entering imminent cardiac failure, or when they grew tired. Jesus was stripped of his garments, and his hands were tied high to a column or low post, forcing his back to curve and tense the skin over the ribcage. The instrument used was the infamous flagrum taxillatum. It consisted of a short wooden handle from which several strips of braided leather departed. But the true evil of the design resided in the tips. At the ends were tied balls of lead and sharp pieces of sheep bone or metal hooks. The sequence of the trauma was devastating. The initial impact, The lead balls struck the skin, causing deep contusions and immediate bruises. The capillaries under the epidermis burst, creating pockets of subcutaneous blood. The cutting. Upon pulling the whip back with an expert wrist movement, the bones and metal hooks dug into the swollen skin and tore it. The first blows cut the epidermis and the dermis, the deepening. As the rhythmic torture continued, the whip reached the subcutaneous and muscular tissue. The muscles of the back, the shoulders, and the legs began to tear. The anatomical horror. Forensic doctors who have studied the Shroud of Turin and historical accounts conclude that the continued flagellation would have turned the back of Jesus into an unrecognizable mass of bleeding tissue, possibly exposing ribs and part of the vertebral structure. The physiological effect on Jesus was immediate and catastrophic. He entered a state of early hypovolemic shock. His body lost a massive amount of blood and interstitial fluids. His heart began to pump furiously to try to carry the little remaining blood to the brain and vital organs. His blood pressure plummeted. His kidneys stopped filtering urine to conserve fluids. An intense and desperate thirst, a classic sign of shock, began to consume him. The flagellation not only sought to cause pain, it sought to dehumanize. It turned a dignified man into a trembling piece of meat. And Jesus endured this, absorbing the wrath of an empire on his own skin, probably on the verge of unconsciousness. The crown and the robe, the parody of the kingdom. If the flagellation destroyed his physical structure, what followed was a deliberate attempt to destroy his mind and his psychological identity. Jesus was taken to the inner courtyard of the Praetorium, where the entire cohort gathered. They were bored, loaded with adrenaline, and saw in this Jewish king an opportunity for sadistic entertainment. Here the mock coronation takes place, a satanic inversion of the imperial ceremony. The robe. They threw a scarlet or purple chlamys over him, probably an old and dirty cloak of an officer. The rough wool fabric must have instantly adhered to the open and coagulated wounds on his back. Like someone ripping a dry bandage from a burn, every time they moved the robe, the wounds would bleed again, renewing the acute pain. The crown. European iconography usually paints an orderly and almost elegant ring of thorns, but botanical studies of the Jerusalem region suggest they used branches of Ziziphus spina Christi, a desert shrub with long, rigid thorns as hard as steel nails. It was not a delicate ring, but a helmet or cap of braided branches that was crushed with blows onto his head. The scalp is one of the most vascularized areas of the human body. The thorns pierced the skin, reaching the periosteum of the skull, causing a profuse hemorrhage that bathed his face, partially blinding him with blood. The scepter. They put a reed in his right hand as a royal scepter. Then they took it from him to hit him on the head with it, driving the thorns even deeper into the trigeminal nerves. "Hail, King of the Jews!" The laughter of hundreds of men echoed in the courtyard, spitting slaps, mocking genuflections. The King of the Universe was being treated as the jester of a macabre circus. Exe homo, the final sentence. Pilato, perhaps naively thinking that the sight of this shattered man would calm the crowd's thirst for blood and provoke pity, brought Jesus out again to the stone balcony. Behold the man! The image must have been horrifying. A human being barely able to stand, covered in blood from head to toe, crowned with thorns, visibly trembling from the cold of traumatic shock. Pilato appealed to the humanity of the mob, but he underestimated the theological hatred. Crucify him! Crucify him! Faced with Pilato's hesitation, the religious leaders played their last card, the definitive political card, the checkmate. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Pilato felt the cold fear for his own life. The phrase "friend of Caesar" was an official honorary title. Losing it meant ruin. If they denounced him to Roma for protecting a rival of the emperor, he was finished. In that moment, truth, justice, and innocence ceased to matter. Pilato asked for water. He washed his hands before the people, a Jewish ritual he adopted sarcastically to absolve himself of guilt. "I am innocent of the blood of this just man. See to it yourselves." And the people responded with the collective sentence that would haunt their nation for centuries in Western history. "His blood be on us and on our children." Pilato released Barabbas, and he delivered Jesus to their will. The official sentence was dictated, "Ibis ad crucem." Via Dolorosa, the weight of humanity. Tradition calls this journey the Via Dolorosa, but for the Romans it was simply the standard procedure of public humiliation. The condemned had to carry his own cross to the place of execution. However, historical evidence corrects the popular image. Jesus did not carry the complete cross but the patibulum, the horizontal wooden crossbeam, which weighed between 35 and 50 kilograms. For a healthy and well-fed man, 40 kilos is a heavy but manageable load. For a man in a state of severe hypovolemic shock, with his back torn to the muscle and without having slept, eaten or drunk water in almost 24 hours, it was a final sentence before the execution. Each step was an impossible victory of the will over biological collapse. The weight of the rough wood on the open wounds of the shoulders caused a lacerating pain, pressing on the damaged nerves and reopening the hemorrhages. The collapse was inevitable. Jesus fell. It was not a stumble, it was the body surrendering to gravity and the lack of oxygen. As his hands were tied to the beam on his shoulders, he could not cushion the fall. His face hit against the dirty stones of Jerusalem. The Roman soldiers, fearing that the prisoner would die before reaching the place of the spectacle, made a pragmatic decision. They seized a passerby who was coming from the countryside, Simon de Cyrene. Simon is a fascinating character. He was not a volunteer. He was a man forced by the imperial sword, probably a Jew of the diaspora who had saved his whole life for that Passover. In an instant, his sacred pilgrimage turned into a nightmare of blood and contact with an impure criminal. But here lies a profound paradox. The man who wanted nothing to do with the cross ended up being the only human being who physically helped God carry the weight of the world. It was the first act of real discipleship, to take up the cross. Golgotha, the theatre of death. The procession left the city walls, crossing the garden gate, toward a mound of abandoned limestone rock, an old quarry known in Aramaic as Golgotha and in Latin as Calvario, place of the skull. The location was not accidental. Roma crucified near the main roads to maximize the advertising terror. The crucifixion was a state advertising poster. This is what happens when you defy Roma. They arrived around 9 in the morning. Before the nails, Jesus was offered a mixture of wine with myrrh or gall. It was a primitive narcotic, an act of traditional mercy from the rich women of Jerusalem to cloud the senses and dull the pain of the condemned. Jesus tasted it, recognized what it was, and rejected it. Why? Theology suggests he wanted to keep his consciousness intact until the end. He did not want to die drugged or sedated. He wanted to face death with a clear mind, drinking the cup of suffering to the dregs, without shortcuts. The anatomy of clinical horror. We arrive now at the epicenter of Roman brutality. If the flagellation was the bloody prologue, what happens on Golgotha is the masterpiece of human cruelty. Jesus arrives at the execution site, known as the place of the skull. But here the romantic narrative stops and the forensic horror begins. Jesus is violently stripped of his clothes for the second time. You have to visualize this. The tunic, stuck to the open wounds on his back by dried blood and coagulated serum, does not slide off smoothly. It is ripped off. The effect is identical to removing a dry bandage from a severe burn, but over the entire body. The blood flows again, the tissues are torn again, and the nerve endings are exposed to the air laden with dust and flies. Jesus is thrown onto his back on the ground. His raw back collides with the rough wood of the patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam of the cross. Did you know that art has lied for centuries about this moment? For hundreds of years, Renaissance painters have drawn the nails piercing the palms of Jesus' hands, but modern science and archaeology reveal a much more sinister truth. If they had nailed the palms, the weight of the body would have torn the lumbrical muscles and the skin. Jesus would have fallen from the cross in a matter of minutes. The Romans did not make engineering mistakes. They perfected death. They knew that the nail had to enter the wrist, specifically at an anatomical point known as the space of Destot, located between the carpal bones and the radius. It is a structurally solid place, a knot of bones and ligaments capable of supporting the weight of an agonizing man indefinitely. The executioner, a legionary expert in practical anatomy, takes a wrought iron nail. They are not smooth industrial nails. They are square, rusty, rough spikes, about 13 to 18 centimeters long. The hammer is raised, and it falls. Here begins the neurological horror. Upon passing through the space of Destot, the nail inevitably crushes or severs the median nerve. This is not a minor nerve. It is one of the main communication cables of the human nervous system. Have you ever felt that electric shock when you hit your elbow on the funny bone? Multiply that sensation by 1,000. Now imagine that shock does not stop. Medicine describes this pain as causalgia. It is a burning pain, a liquid fire that travels from the hand, runs up the arm, reaches the shoulder and explodes in the brain like a continuous lightning bolt. It is a pain so intense that it can cause fainting from neurogenic shock. By damaging this nerve, an immediate motor reaction occurs. The thumbs of Jesus contract violently and close toward the palm of the hand. It is a permanent spasmodic claw. Once both wrists are fixed, the lifting maneuver begins. The crossbeam, with the victim nailed to it, is hoisted by means of ropes until it fits into the vertical post that was already planted in the earth. And here the first massive structural trauma occurs. When the crossbeam falls into the notch of the post, the body of Jesus descends sharply, stopped only by the nails in his wrists. The force of gravity does its cruel work. Doctors estimate that at this moment, the shoulders of Jesus probably dislocated, pulling the head of the humerus out of its socket. His arms stretched at least 15 centimeters more than their normal length. Now he is a broken body, hanging in an unnatural position. Finally, the feet. To nail them, the soldiers had to flex his knees and turn his legs. A single massive nail pierced both insteps, severing the deep plantar nerves. Now Jesus is a figure suspended between heaven and earth, a map of living pain. But the worst is not the pain of the nails. The true extermination machine of the cross is invisible. The dance of death. There is a popular myth that says the victims of crucifixion died from bleeding. This is false. Crucifixion is, in essence, a slow and torturous death by mechanical asphyxiation. Let's analyze the biomechanics of the position. With the arms extended in a Y shape and the weight of the body pulling downward, the ribcage of Jesus is in a position of maximum expansion. The intercostal and pectoral muscles are stretched to the limit. This creates a terrifying physiological paradox. Jesus can inhale with relative ease, but he cannot exhale. His lungs fill with air, but the position of his arms blocks the exit. The air is trapped. To survive, to get that stale air out and take a new breath, Jesus must make an active, superhuman effort against gravity. This is where what forensic scientists call the dance of death begins. To exhale, Jesus has to do the following. He must push his entire weight upward by supporting himself on the nail that pierces his feet. This sends a jolt of unbearable pain through the shattered plantar nerves. Simultaneously, he must flex his elbows and do a pull-up, pulling on the nails in his wrists. This reactivates the fire of causalgia in the median nerve, sending electric shocks to his skull. By rising a few centimeters, the tension in his chest momentarily decreases, allowing him to exhale the carbon dioxide and take a quick breath of oxygen. But the muscular exhaustion is immediate. He cannot hold himself up. His body falls again, left hanging by the wrists, and the cycle of asphyxiation begins again. Imagine doing this once. Now imagine doing it 1,000 times. But there is a sadistic detail that we often forget. Remember his back, that back that was turned into minced meat by the Roman flagrum a few hours before. Every time Jesus pushes himself up to breathe and lets himself fall from exhaustion, his bare back rubs against the splintered and rough wood of the cross. Up, down, up, down. It is like rubbing an open wound with coarse sandpaper. The wood embeds itself in the exposed flesh, reopening the wounds, scraping the bones of the back ribs. Each breath is not just a muscular effort, it is an absolute tactile torture. On a chemical level, his blood is entering a crisis. Due to the shallow and incomplete breathing, carbon dioxide begins to accumulate in his bloodstream, a condition called hypercapnia. The CO2 turns into carbonic acid, making his blood acidic. This causes uncontrollable muscle cramps. His muscles, deprived of oxygen and full of lactic acid, begin to tetanize. They become as stiff as stones. Jesus is trapped in a body that is becoming its own rigid tomb, fighting for every molecule of air while his own metabolism poisons him from within. Death is stalking him, but his heart, strong and young, refuses to give up yet. The agony is designed to last for days. But something strange is about to happen in the sky. Darkness at noon and the cry of abandonment. While this biological battle is waged in silence, the social scene is equally brutal. Above his head, Poncio Pilato has ordered a titulus to be placed, a wooden sign covered in plaster. The inscription is a political mockery and an accidental truth. It is written in 3 languages: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Jesus Nazareno, Rey de los Judíos. The high priests, indignant, demanded of Pilato, "Do not write King of the Jews, but that he said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" Pilato, fed up with their manipulations and reaffirming the absolute authority of Roma, responded with a lapidary phrase, "Quod scripsi, scripsi." It was the supreme irony. The pagan empire proclaimed the theological truth to the whole world. Below, at the foot of the cross, the banality of evil runs its course. 4 Roman soldiers, indifferent to the suffering of one more criminal, sit down to play dice. They divide his few possessions. The tunic of Jesus, woven in one piece, is too valuable to tear, so they cast lots for it. While they gamble for his clothes, Jesus utters the first of his 7 final phrases, and it is perhaps the most revolutionary phrase in the ethical history of humanity. In the midst of the pain of the median nerves, with his lungs burning for lack of air, Jesus does not curse Roma. He does not scream for vengeance against the Pharisees. He looks at his executioners and says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He breaks the cycle of blood. He stops the wheel of karma. He offers amnesty to the men who are driving metals into his body. But then the atmosphere changes drastically. It is noon, the 6th hour. The sun is at its zenith over Judea. Suddenly the light fails. The Gospels relate that a supernatural darkness covered the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. It was not a common solar eclipse. The Jewish Passover always occurs during the full moon, and a solar eclipse is astronomically impossible with a full moon. It was something more, a dense, heavy darkness that silenced the birds and chilled the desert air. In that darkness, the suffering of Jesus passes from the physical to the spiritual. Throughout his eternal existence, Jesus had lived in an uninterrupted communion with the Father. But now, by symbolically and spiritually bearing the sin of the world, all the evil, the filth, the violence, and the shame of human history, that connection is broken. Jesus experiences absolute isolation. At 3 in the afternoon, breaking the sepulchral silence, Jesus cries out with a heart-rending voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." This was not a whisper of resignation. It was the roar of a wounded lion. It was the deepest moment of cosmic solitude ever recorded. The Son of God was completely alone in the universe, absorbing a spiritual abyss that we cannot even begin to comprehend. And his body was about to collapse. Tetelestai, the financial victory. It is 3 in the afternoon. The body of Jesus has reached its absolute biological limit. The acidosis has poisoned his tissues. His heart is failing. Due to the hypovolemic shock and the extreme effort, his heart beats at a frantic pace, trying to pump blood that no longer has oxygen. At the same time, fluid has begun to accumulate around his heart and his lungs, compressing the vital organs like a hydraulic vice. Jesus knows that the end has come. He knows that the prophecy has been fulfilled. He asks for water and they give him vinegar. Then he gathers the last reserve of oxygen he has left. He pushes himself one last time on the nails of his feet, enduring the lacerating pain to fill his lungs for the last time. He does not utter a groan of defeat. The eyewitnesses, like Matteo and Juan, insist that he let out a great cry, a cry of conquest. Tetelestai. This Greek word is fundamental. It does not simply mean it is over. In the commercial papyri of the time, tetelestai was the word that merchants wrote on tax receipts or debts when the payment had been completed. It means paid in full, or it is finished. It is not the voice of a victim, it is the voice of a payer who has just settled an infinite debt. The spiritual transaction was complete, and then, with a calm that contrasts with the violence of the moment, he whispers, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And he breathed his last. He died voluntarily. No one took his life from him. He gave it. In that precise instant, the physical world reacted. Matteo relates an earthquake. The rocks were split, but the most significant event occurred a few hundred meters from there, in the glorious Temple of Jerusalem. Inside the temple, separating the holy place from the most holy place, there was a massive veil. According to the historian Josefo, this veil was 18 meters high, 9 meters wide, and a handbreadth thick. It was so heavy that it took 300 priests to handle it. It was the physical barrier between sinful man and the holiness of God. At the moment Jesus died, that veil was torn. But it was not torn from the bottom, as if someone had cut it. It was torn from top to bottom. The symbolism was terrifying for the religious caste. God himself had broken the barrier. The system of animal sacrifices had ended. Access to the divine was no longer restricted by rites or priests. It was open through the broken body of that man on the cross. The coup de grace and the silence of the tomb. The Jewish leaders were in a hurry. The sun was going down and the Sabbath began at sunset. Jewish law forbade leaving bodies exposed during the holy day. They asked Pilato to hasten the death of the condemned. The Roman soldiers then proceeded with the brutal Crucifixion. Using a solid iron mallet, the soldiers struck the shins of the crucified with brutal force. The objective was to break the leg bones. Why? Remember the mechanics of breathing. To breathe, the victim needs to push up with his legs. If you break the legs, the victim can no longer rise. He loses his point of support. The entire weight hangs from the arms, the chest locks up, and death by asphyxiation occurs in a matter of minutes. They did this to the two thieves on the sides of Jesus. The sound of the bones breaking must have been nauseating, followed by the final gurgles of asphyxiation. But when the soldier came to the center, to Jesus, he stopped. He saw that he had already passed away. His head had fallen, his chest was still. There was no need to break his legs. However, to comply with Roman legal protocol and ensure that it was not a deep coma or a faint, a soldier raised his spear. With a sure and professional blow, he drove the spear into the right side of Jesus, directing it upward, piercing the lung and reaching the heart. Juan, the only disciple who had the courage to be at the foot of the cross, describes a medical detail astonishingly precise for the time. Instantly, blood and water came out. Modern medicine explains this clearly. The blood came from the right atrium of the heart. The water was actually pericardial and pleural fluid accumulated from the traumatic stress and heart failure. It is the final forensic evidence. Jesus did not just die of asphyxiation. He died, literally and medically, with a broken heart. But the story does not end with a corpse in the trash. Normally, the crucified were thrown into a common grave, the Gehenna, to be devoured by wild dogs. It was part of the punishment, to deny them an honorable burial. But here, something unexpected happens. Two rich and powerful men, members of the Sanhedrin who had believed in Jesus in secret, José de Arimatea and Nicodemo, come out of the shadows. They risk their reputation and their social position. They go before Pilato and ask for the body. Pilato, surprised that Jesus had died so quickly, verifies the death with the centurion and hands over the corpse. It was a hurried burial. There was no time to wash the body, nor for the complete rituals of mourning because the sun was setting and the Sabbath was beginning. They lowered the body with care, removing the nails that had bitten his bones. They wrapped it in fine linen cloths and covered it with about 30 kilos of aromatic spices that Nicodemo had brought. It was a quantity of spices worthy of a king, not a criminal. They laid him in a new tomb, hewn from the living rock, located in a garden near the place of execution. Finally, they rolled a large disc-shaped stone on a rail carved into the ground, sealing the entrance. The stone weighed between 1 and 2 tons. To ensure that no one would steal the body and feign a resurrection, the religious leaders asked Pilato to secure the tomb. The Roman seal was placed, a rope with wax and the imperial emblem. To break that seal meant the automatic death penalty. In addition, a guard of elite Roman soldiers was posted in front of the rock. The sun set. Darkness covered Jerusalem. The cold and lifeless body of the man who claimed to be God lay in the darkness of a stone cave. The world fell silent. It seemed that evil had won. The legacy of the blood. The crucifixion of Jesus de Nazareth, under any logical or historical analysis, should have been the absolute end of the story. It should have been a forgotten footnote in the administrative archives of the province of Judea, another false messiah, another Jewish rebel crushed by the efficient and implacable machinery of the Caesar. His followers, a group of terrified fishermen and tax collectors, should have dispersed, ashamed of having dedicated 3 years of their lives to a man who ended up naked, humiliated and dead on a cursed piece of wood. Logic dictates that the movement should have died with the leader, but the impossible happened. That death was not an endpoint. It was a spiritual Big Bang. 3 days after, the tomb was empty, and those same cowardly men who fled during the execution suddenly went out into the streets of the Roman Empire willing to die, tortured and decapitated, proclaiming that they had seen him alive. No one dies for a lie that they know is a lie. Something happened that changed the structure of reality. Think about it for a second. Alejandro Magno, Julio Cesar, Napoleon. Men who conquered the world with the sword, with armies, with brute force. Their empires fragmented and disappeared into the dust of history the moment their hearts stopped beating. Jesus conquered the world with a cross. His empire truly began after his last breath. The cross, the most detestable object of the ancient world, the Roman equivalent of the electric chair or the lethal injection, but worse because it was a public spectacle of shame, was alchemically transmuted. That instrument of torture became the most recognized symbol of hope, healing, philanthropy and love on the face of the earth. We crown our churches with it. We wear it on our necks as jewelry. We place it on the graves of our loved ones as a promise of life. The history of human civilizations is the history of men who tried to be gods, building pyramids, triumphal arches and skyscrapers for their own pride. The history of the crucifixion is the history of a god who became man and built a monument to his humility using wood, nails, and his own blood. Today, in the middle of the 21st century, with all our technology, our artificial intelligence, our space travel and our digital noise, the world continues to revolve chronologically around the death of that Jewish carpenter. Every time you look at the date on your phone, every time you sign a document, you are acknowledging that history was split in two, before him and after him. The Passion is not just a tale of forensic pain or an ancient tragedy. It is the radical testimony of how far love can go when it decides to face absolute darkness to rescue what was lost. The voices of the executioners died out. Pilato and the Caesar turned to dust of ruins. The temple was destroyed stone by stone in the year 70 AD. But the message of the man who died whispering forgiveness continues to resonate, unshakable, to the ends of the earth. The tomb was closed on Friday under the weight of the stone and the authority of Roma. But the story, as we well know, the story was just beginning.